People who discovered a secret room in their house. What's the creepiest thing you found inside? Back in college, some friends and I rented an old mansion built in the early 1920s from an elderly lady. The place was falling apart, but it was huge and the rent was dirt cheap. About 2 years into living there, I went to the basement to do some laundry and momentarily lost my balance, reaching out to steady myself on one of the wall panels. It flexed more than I expected, and after a closer look, I realized it was removable. Behind it was a small, mostly empty, very dirty concrete room of about 100 square feet. I say mostly empty because right in the middle was a hole the size of a well that had been bricked up. The bricks had eroded over time, exposing a circle of roughly 2 feet in diameter out of the full 5-foot hole. After calling my friends down to look, I got the courage to creep closer and peer into it. There was another room, roughly the same size but deep, maybe 15 feet down, mostly filled with dirt. We shined a flashlight down, and I could swear there was a teddy bear at the bottom. Despite plenty of bargaining, none of us could work up the courage, liquid or otherwise, to tie a rope and climb down for a closer look, especially after noticing that the bricks I thought had fallen in were all accounted for, scattered around the hole, as if something had broken out. At the risk of this being discovered by my Redditor friends, this was in Pittsburgh. We did a little research and think the sub-basement may have been related to Prohibition, but honestly, I'm willing to accept that explanation to avoid lifelong nightmares. Story 2. I was pretty young, maybe 7 or 8. So I don't remember all the details. My family moved into a new house, new to us, but perhaps 20 years old. There was one closet in my older sister's room, who was around 9 or 10 at the time. It wasn't very big, but it had a tiny door in the back wall. It was locked, and my parents never showed much interest in it. I sort of forgot about it over time, until one day I was hanging out in my sister's room, and somehow she got it open. An awful smell came over us. I think we just assumed it was because the house was old. We didn't go inside. The doorway was so small, and it was already creepy and dark in there. We shut the door and got distracted by something else pretty quickly. A day or two later, my sister mentioned the closet to my parents. They seemed a little confused, but mostly amused. My dad went to check it out. After a few minutes, he called my mom upstairs. She went up, and a little later, came back down. I just remember her asking if we wanted to go to the park. My dad stayed behind. According to my sister, Mom was acting strangely. When we got back home, there were bags in the car with our things. Apparently, our grandma had invited us to stay with her for a couple of nights. So, we drove the 20 minutes to her house and stayed for 3 nights, then 4. I think it was about a week before we returned home. When we did, the door was sealed shut and eventually replaced with drywall. My parents never talked about what was behind the door. I always wanted to ask them, but they both died in a car accident when I was 15. Story 3. My sister and I shared a basement bedroom in a house we were renting. The owners had slept in that room when they lived there, while all of their kids slept upstairs. We noticed that one of the wooden wall panels looked loose, so our brother carefully pried it off. Behind it was a hidden room with monitors lining the wall and a random assortment of items. The monitors weren't connected to anything, but they explained why each room upstairs had small holes in the corners of the ceilings. My mom eventually asked the owners about it to be sure, and yes, they had cameras in their kids' rooms, and we had found the creepy headquarters. We moved out not long after that. Story 4. One of the houses I lived in during middle school had a hidden space like this. I had been living there for about 1.5 years when we were doing some cleaning and reorganizing. My dad asked me to find some space in the garage to store things, so I started searching. I didn't find much in the garage itself, so I tried to see if there was access to the space above it. In one corner of the garage, part of the wall was just plywood, and I knew it wasn't an exterior panel. This piece was about 8 feet off the ground and roughly the size of a large air duct, so I figured it must be a crawl space entrance to the attic. I called my dad over so he could boost me up to the hole to crawl in and see if we could store things there. To my surprise, when I reached in and touched the floor, it was carpeted. I crawled in, and though it was too dark to see clearly, I started to get a little on edge. I yelled to my dad that there was carpet up here, and he assumed I was feeling insulation or something. I asked him to pass up the flashlight, and whoa. When I stood up, it was a full room with old wallpaper, a carpeted floor, a sink, not connected to water, and a small closet with a single chair in the middle. There was no window, only a small air duct near the ceiling leading outside. There was also a single bare bulb in the room, but it didn't work. I was absolutely terrified at this point. Let me tell you, I was trying to explain to my dad what I was seeing, and he was both confused and convinced I was messing with him. With the flashlight in hand, I went to check the closet, fully expecting to find a dead body. I had my fist cocked and was ready to fight something when I opened the door, and nothing. After getting my dad and brother up into the room, whose only entrance was that small hole, we decided it might have been an old paint studio, since there was dried paint in the sink, or possibly something far more sinister. In the end, we used it for storage and never told anyone about it when we moved out. It wasn't on the blueprints or any of the house paperwork, and my dad didn't want to do any more work than he had to. But we still remember that creepy nothing room, and sometimes wonder if anyone else has found it since. Story 5. We bought a house built in the 1880s, lived in it for 7 years, and then needed some wiring work done. The electrician was in the basement and wanted to drill through a brick wall to the outside, for a reason I no longer remember. We gave him the okay and went about our business. He started drilling, then stopped, came upstairs, and told us he had just found a bricked up room. He asked what we wanted to do about it. Well, we still wanted the wiring done, but if there was a body or some kind of odd creature in there, I definitely wanted to know. On the other hand, I didn't want my sister's boyfriend knocking the wall down with a sledgehammer. As we discussed it, the electrician offered to run a scope through the hole he had drilled, so we could look without doing more damage, or as he put it, destroying evidence. He set up the scope, and we all went down to the basement to watch the monitor. It was a very small space, maybe 3 by 5 feet. Nothing in there but a really old, gross-looking plushie. Not a teddy bear, maybe a dog. It was sewn out of some kind of patterned fabric in a vaguely dog-like shape. That was it, nothing else. The electrician asked what we wanted to do. I asked if he could seal the hole he had drilled, because this was definitely how ghost movies start. He agreed, patched it up, drilled somewhere else, finished the rewiring, and we all went on with our lives. We moved out 2 years later, and as far as I know, Haunted Doggy is still bricked up in the basement of that house. Story 6. My parents bought a house from an elderly family member to help her pay for nursing home care. She hadn't lived in the house for years at that point. She was a hoarder, and we spent the summer cleaning it up to make it livable before school started. Rat carcasses fused to the carpet, old tax documents from the 1960s, and so on. While scraping up the linoleum tiles covering the original hardwood floor in a side room, I joked that the previous resident might have been a secret mass murderer and that there could be a trap door under the linoleum full of dead bodies. I pulled up a huge section of tiling and found a trap door underneath. It scared the shit out of me. When we finally mustered the courage to open it, we discovered there was nothing under it, just a walled-off section of the basement with a dirt floor. We suspect it was an old root cellar from back when farmers needed a cold, dark place to store their goods to prevent spoilage. Story 7. I found a secret space in my closet when my mom and I were moving out of the house. She had been renting to move into my stepdad's home. I never noticed it before, because junk had been piled in front of a section of the wall that concealed a small entrance to a room, sealed off with boards and plywood. I couldn't pry it open, but I could see light shining through, and a single mason jar, which I assumed was filled with water. The air was cold in there, as if the central heating didn't even reach that part of the house. I showed it to my mom, and she said she didn't remember seeing it when we had moved in 8 years earlier. Since we were moving out, it didn't matter. The room gave me the creeps for some reason. I still don't know why it was sealed off, or why there was a lone mason jar filled with water in the center. Story 8. The story of the murder room. I grew up in an old farmhouse with 2 floors and a basement. The basement was creepy as hell. Rickety wood slat stairs, stone walls, dim lighting, an L shape with dark corners, and I swear a single hanging light bulb near one of the corners. Oh, and the spiders. So many spiders and cobwebs. Weirdly, these spiders turned bright white when they died for some reason. At the back of the basement, it always seemed cut short. So one day my brother and I decided to explore under the old back porch, which was overgrown with weeds. That's when we found a door to another room that had been walled off from the rest of the basement. Door is probably an overstatement. It was more like a hanging half door made from weathered 2x4s. With big metal hinges. It wouldn't move when we tried to open it, so for years we jokingly called it the murder room, daring friends to go inside, which no one ever would. The legend grew. What could be in this room? If it was just for storage, why would it be walled off from the rest of the basement? Eventually, we were able to lift the door ever so slightly, but it was pitch dark inside. One day, my big brother pushed me in, and that was when our mom finally told us to stop messing around back there. She said the old door was dangerous, that it could swing down on us, and she didn't want us playing there anymore. Of course, that only made our interest grow. While freaking out inside the room, I realized something strange. Even though I couldn't see anything, I could tell the floor was dirt. What the hell was going on? Years later, my mom had the old carpets thrown out and finally fixed the wood floors underneath, like she had always wanted. While cleaning out a tiny closet under the stairs, I noticed that some of the floorboards formed a distinct square. It was directly over the murder room. I pulled the square up and saw the same dirt floor I had felt years earlier. My girlfriend and I climbed down and found a small chair and a child's school desk. Take that however you want, but it freaked us out. Later, I found out that many buildings in our town had been linked to the Underground Railroad. Take that as you will, but that's the story of the murder room. Story 9. When I was a kid, my parents moved into an ancient mansion. By Oklahoma standards and the age of the house, it would have qualified as a mansion in the late 1800s, but by modern standards, it was just a slightly larger house, drafty as hell, and impossible to keep warm in winter. The attic had been finished and turned into a very large bedroom, which we used as a playroom. We were instructed not to go into the little storage closets in each corner of the room. Of course, that's exactly where we went to play. Inside the closets were gaps where a small child, but certainly not an adult, could crawl along the eaves. We were young and foolish. It never occurred to us that breaking through could have meant falling 3 stories to our deaths. After crawling through the eaves for a while, it opened into another finished room, floored and fully enclosed from the inside. There was no door. The room was only about 5 feet by 5 feet, but to this day we have no idea where it came from. As far as we could tell, aside from the 4 closets in each corner, there simply wasn't any space for the room, but there it was. Inside the room was a stool, a small table, an old oil lamp, and lots of small animal skeletons and remains in various stages of mummification or decay. Rabbits, birds, cats, squirrels, and more. Far too many to be an accident. Surprisingly, it smelled musty, rather than like rotting flesh. At first, we didn't tell our parents about the room. We didn't want to get in trouble for going into the closets, and the implication of numerous animal corpses was lost on our 5- and 6-year-old brains. After a few years, we finally told them, and they straight up didn't believe us. My brother went in and retrieved the oil lamp, which my parents just shrugged off as something we had probably found in the old closets. They never believed the room actually existed, but as small as those eaves were, only a child could have gotten back there. The table must have been brought in 3 separate pieces. My guess is someone originally intended to make it another room, hence the finished walls with wooden slats covered in old plaster, but maybe they decided it was too small and never installed a door. Decades later, I can't help but think that was the hidey-hole of a future serial killer. Story 10. My grandma's house is about 244 years old. I think I was around 12 before I realized there was an extra window between the kitchen and what was then the living room, which has since resumed service as the dining room. Logically, it didn't make sense. I knew there was a butler's pantry between the 2 rooms, but I also knew there was no window in it. I climbed through the huge overgrown bushes almost over, the window, and eventually found a hidden door. It reminded me of the part in The Secret Garden where Mary discovers the door in the ivy. It wouldn't open, and I was too small to look through the window. Unlike in the book, a little bird never showed me where the key was buried, unfortunately. I kind of forgot about it, assuming it was just as forbidden as the 3rd floor and attic, which was fine with me because that's where the Shadow Man lived. That's a whole other story. A few years ago, my aunt uploaded an album to Facebook documenting what had become a long-abandoned project to renovate the old family homestead. The workers had cleared the overgrown back of the house and removed the door from its hinges. It turned out to be nothing, just a little extra storage space that had been cleaned out decades ago. But she also shared some history of the house, which made it kinda cool to see. The house used to have an annex at some point, forming a T-shape, though the dates are unknown. There are absolutely no known pictures of the annex, which is frustrating. My aunt, who has a strong interest in family history, said she thought the window must have been original to the house, and that the shed was basically leftover empty space after the annex was eventually demolished. If anyone's interested, I can try to find pictures of the house. I really love that place. My aunt used to have a well-known collection of historical items, which I've seen with my own eyes, but no one knows where it is now. I'll have to copy it online the next time I get access to it. Story 11. Friends of mine rented a holiday villa in Mexico years ago and stayed there for 3 weeks. It had been advertised as 4 bedrooms, 3 baths, so they were a little frustrated to find that there were only 2 bathrooms and that the 4th bedroom was quite small. The day before they were leaving, they did a bit of cleanup. One of my friends went to put the broom into the closet beside the fridge. When he opened the door, he discovered that it led to a massive room with its own bathroom and balcony. The first night they had arrived, one of them had tried the door, thought it was locked, and assumed it was just storage for cleaning supplies or extra linens. After that, no one had thought to try it again until it was accidentally opened the day before leaving. Story 12. A couple of years ago, I rented an apartment in a massive old-style building. I had no idea how old it was. During the showing, they showed me a door with an elaborate staircase that went straight up to the ceiling and explained that it led to the attic, which was sealed. When I was finally moving out, curiosity got the better of me. I pushed on the panel at the top of the stairs until it popped open and hoisted myself up. It was completely dark, and the floor was covered in at least an inch of dust. I discovered that it was an entire extra floor attached to my unit. Old, rotting furniture and magazines were scattered throughout the rooms. I eventually found a small hole in one of the walls that led into the sealed-off upstairs of the unit next door, and decided to go through that one too. At the back end of that area, I found another small hole leading to the next space. I made my way through about 5 or 6 of these sealed-off areas, which had no entrances, except these tiny holes in the drywall. The farther I went, the older the furniture became. Fridges from the 50s or earlier, old dishware, and dust covering everything. The last unit was the most fascinating hand-painted scenes on the walls and holes in the attic, letting sunlight stream in. I took small videos, though they're all on Snapchat and hard to share. I must have been up there for hours, exploring alone in the dark. I was lucky to have the only room with access. Story 13. There was a hidden door behind the wallpaper in the hallway. Obviously, the doorknob had been removed, so it blended seamlessly with the wall. We had lived in this house for 6 years, and I only found out about the door 2 years ago. When we finally opened it, we saw a skeleton in the corner. Not gonna lie, it scared me shitless, though it turned out to be just a prop left by the previous owners. Story 14. My old house had a strangely large concrete slab in the corner of the yard, covered by a ton of leaves when we moved in. I thought it might have been a foundation for a shed, but it was in a very odd location. Years later, as I was preparing to move, it bothered me that I still didn't know what it was for. I got a friend to help me dig around it, expecting to confirm that it was just an old foundation. We dug for days in the middle of August, starting at night to avoid the heat. We reached about 15 feet down, and the concrete showed no sign of ending. Eventually, we struck a pipe with a nozzle and noticed more concrete extending toward the center of the yard. About a week later, my dad came home and nearly had a stroke when he saw we were digging up half the yard. We had sold the house and were supposed to leave by September 1st. He made us fill it all in, and I left home without ever discovering what it really was. Some of my teachers, who were longtime town residents, told me the neighborhood had been farmland before development, and that there may have been several bomb or fallout shelters in the area. I would have loved to find an entrance to the bunker, if that's what it was. Story 15. After 15 years, we discovered a second basement in our farmhouse. My father had removed one of the large rocks that made up the basement wall. I crawled under the log frame a few feet and found a wall made of baseball-sized rocks. I knocked them down and entered an old root cellar. There were shelves, shattered mason jars, and bones, lots and lots of bones. We dug a tunnel so we could access the room. In my current house, I found many secret areas behind wood panels. The first secret door was in the basement and led to an underground bomb shelter with a separate air intake and water line. I knew of it before buying the home, and it was a major selling point. It was stocked with a radiation detector and used mostly for storage. The second room was only 3 feet high, with a light and filled with toys, crayons, and drawings. I didn't find that one for a few months. After about 2 weeks, I discovered a few hidden panels with shelves containing toys, magazines, books, and some clothing. Nothing particularly interesting. After a year or two, I located a suspicious wooden panel on the floor. I pried it open slightly and saw a full-length staircase leading to a brick wall. I haven't bothered to fully open the panel yet. Story 16. I'm a contractor. I was renovating a 4-unit craftsman apartment building when the owner mentioned a void in the floor plan and asked us to investigate. We cut a small hole to peek inside and found a room approximately 5 feet by 5 feet. The strange thing was that the room had been fully sheetrocked, taped, textured, and painted from the inside. There were no doors or openings, just 4 walls and a ceiling. The only explanation we could think of is that someone finished the room from the inside and then dropped down through the subfloor to the garage below. There wasn't an obvious subfloor patch either. It was really strange. Story 17. I used to live in a 2-story house built in 1900. This was almost 20 years ago, so it was just over 100 years old at the time. The back section of the house included the kitchen and attic, while the painted red brick level was the basement. My first clue to how old the house was came from a cast iron plate with a movable half dial attached to the baseboard in the living room. It was rusted and dirty, but after cleaning, I could make out the manufacturer's name, something like Philadelphia Furnace Company, or maybe Pittsburgh. I guess it was a vent control, a 19th century version of a thermostat. The house had an unfinished basement and attic. Not exactly secret spaces, but both were difficult to access and had some odd contents and peculiarities. The basement extended into the foundation at the front of the house. Once you descended the rickety wooden stairs, You would be standing on a dirt floor with ancient concrete foundation walls on either side, about chest high. A path or walkway ran through the foundation until the area opened up more toward the back of the house, where the ground was lower. Some modern structural jacks had been added to the foundation for additional support. I found all sorts of interesting artifacts stacked around the foundation near the stairs, with the older items literally buried in several inches of fine dirt. Very old brown glass bottles, possibly medicine bottles, a small bone-handled brush, maybe a very old toothbrush, though the head was twice the length of a modern toothbrush, and boxes from a first or second generation Apple Macintosh, circa 1987, in perfect condition. Every trip down there felt like an archaeological dig. This first area had a bare hanging bulb, which was the only working light in the basement. At the rear corner of the basement, reachable only after taking a big U-shaped path through the cut in the foundation and clearing cobwebs along the way, there was an old door in a brick wall nearly falling off its hinges. It led to a separate room, roughly 10 by 15 feet, maybe slightly larger. The basement light didn't reach this room. That's where things started to get a little weird. That room almost looked like the remnants of an old grow operation, but I don't think that's what it was. The first noticeably strange thing was that the ceiling was covered in old electrical wiring and multiple rows of copper light fixtures, arranged in a grid pattern of maybe 12 to 20 lights. The wiring and fixtures obviously weren't original to the house, but they weren't new either. Insulation was stripped or falling off in many places, with wire cores frayed, broken, or missing in sections. The copper fixtures were tarnished, and no bulbs remained. I don't remember seeing a visible switch, and fortunately, the wiring didn't seem connected to a live breaker. This room had old rough wood flooring, unlike the rest of the basement. It also had an exterior door, very old and not very sturdy, with an old padlock. I didn't have the key. That door isn't visible in the picture above. It would have been under the wooden staircase, where the view is blocked by the kitchen area. Aside from the lights, there were no signs of a grow operation. No irrigation, no mold or water damage, no soil, just dry, fine dust. The light fixtures were for incandescent bulbs, and clearly far older than modern compact fluorescents. I always wondered why so many lights were needed for such a small basement room. The basement always made me feel a bit uneasy, but I found myself fascinated by that back room. I would occasionally make trips down there during the day for no real reason, despite the overall creepiness of the place. During the winter, I would sometimes hear the most awful demonic moaning, growling, and screaming coming up through the living room floorboards from the basement below. It turned out there was a gap somewhere, and stray tomcats would sneak in to warm up, then end up facing off and fighting when they ran into each other in close quarters. The first time I heard it, I admit it made my blood run cold until I figured out what it was. On maybe my second or third trip to the basement room, I brought a better flashlight and took a closer look at the walls. That's when I realized the entire right-hand wall was covered in writing, scratched into the surface from floor to ceiling. It may have been plaster over exterior brick, but it was hard to tell because of the wear and the gray patina of dirt covering it. The writing wasn't obvious at first, since it was beneath that layer, and the scratches had smoothed over with age. Whoever carved it there must have done so decades before I saw it. Very little of the writing was legible for several reasons. Most of it consisted of shallow scratches, and it had darkened to match the surrounding wall. Still, I could make out individual letters here and there, enough to know it was writing, not random marks. One small section of writing near the center of the wall was scratched deeper and larger than the rest, and it clearly spelled out a name, Delia. I told a couple of friends about it, and they laughed it off, probably thinking I was joking. So I took them down to the basement and showed them. They didn't want to stick around and refused to go down a second time. After that, whenever they were visiting and we heard odd noises coming from the basement, I'd say, "Oh, that's probably just Delia." They didn't find that very funny, so I'd quickly and awkwardly explain that there were probably stray cats down there. One of those friends is dead now, and the other I haven't spoken to in probably 15 years. So things get weirder with the attic. The attic was above my kitchen, which had very high ceilings, so high that I could barely reach the attic trapdoor with a stepladder. I never would have been able to climb up there without a much taller ladder. A couple of times, I tried to get a better look, but even with the ladder, I could never get my eyes above the opening. All I could see were the roof and beams, directly above the trapdoor. The strange thing was that the beams were charred. It seemed the house, or at least the roof, had burned at some point, but only suffered light damage. Aside from the superficially charred beams, the roofing was in pristine condition, and clearly much newer than the rest of the house. The attic over the kitchen and downstairs hallway sat at about the same level as the second story, which didn't extend over the kitchen, maybe slightly lower. It likely shared a wall with my bedroom closet. The really strange thing about the attic was that during the winter, I would hear footsteps up there at night. I knew the noises in the basement were cats, but the attic sounds were harder to explain. Whatever it was would pace back and forth restlessly, sometimes for hours at a time. And it was loud. It didn't sound like it was on 4 feet. It sounded like a small person wearing heavy little shoes or boots. That's the only way I can describe it. It was unmistakably bipedal. I really wanted it to be a raccoon, but in my experience, raccoons just don't walk like that. This wasn't subtle at all. These weren't the creaks and pops of a house settling. There was no chance I was imagining it. Something was walking around up there in an attic I couldn't access, night after night, tormenting me. It had to be an owl, or a raccoon, or a possum, anything other than what it sounded like. Some nights, I would spend an hour or two pacing along underneath it, trying to measure its stride based on the sound and the number of steps between where it turned around. Based on that, I figured it was maybe 2 to 3 feet tall. It sounded bigger, but I always rounded down for the sake of my sanity. Sometimes I would deliberately stomp around and hit the ceiling with a broom out of desperation. I may have even yelled at it. It would usually pause for a moment, then start right back up again, back and forth, for hours. It was the weirdest damn thing. And to this day I have no idea what was living in that hidden space. My friends thought I had lost my mind when I told them about it. I insisted I wasn't joking about Delia's room, and that I was just as serious about this. They always assumed it was an elaborate put-on, or that I had finally lost it. Until one night, when the damn thing started pacing while they were visiting. Usually it waited until I was alone, but I guess we were quieter than usual that night. Shh, I said. Listen, you hear that? Do you hear that? I told you it was real. I made them stand in the hallway directly beneath its path, where it could be heard the loudest. They weren't laughing anymore. They weren't smiling at all. Their faces had gone white. Suddenly they realized it was much later than they'd thought, and they both said they had to leave immediately. After that, they never really visited late at night again, and they refused to even talk about the pacing. I lived in that house for a couple of years and moved out about 16 years ago. I don't believe in supernatural nonsense. It wasn't a spooky ghost, okay? I just have no frigging idea what was going on in that attic. It was friggin' weird, man. Story 18. When I was a kid, my grandparents lived down the street from me and had a huge house on the river. The house was so big that whenever all my cousins came over, we'd play hide and seek, and it would take forever to find everyone. Most of the time, people only came out because they had to use the bathroom or something. The usual hiding spots were all the storage areas in the basement. There were piles of folding chairs, boxes of children's clothes, mountains of toys from the 60s we never played with, and a workshop where you could move boxes around to hide under the table and off the floor. The game was even better when the person counting didn't stay on the stairs, because then we could run upstairs and hide in the rest of the house. Behind the couch, in the curtains, in closets, normal stuff, except the house had 6 bedrooms, a pantry, 5 bathrooms, and closets everywhere. We were playing as usual, and a younger cousin was following me, which is the worst thing in hide and seek. I hopped into the front entrance closet where everyone hung their coats and put their boots, because there was room for both of us. While we were in there, I noticed a door I had never seen before. It was probably 3 feet high, square, with a cabinet knob-style handle, and no latch or lock. When we opened it, my cousin was terrified, because it was pitch black. We were already inside a closet, and there was no natural light at all, so I told him to run out and grab a toy lightsaber to use as a light while I explored. The room went back maybe 50 feet, and was set up kind of like a sauna, with a main floor area, and a step running all the way around the room where you could sit. The ceiling was only a little higher than the door, so we could sit on the raised step, but I couldn't stand up. The entire room was filled with objects that felt like snakeskin purses, but they were very rigid and oddly shaped. I couldn't tell what they were because it was still completely dark. When my cousin came back with the lightsaber, the dim glow revealed the room was filled with 40 to 50 violin cases, all empty, with absolutely nothing else in the room. There was no dust, no grime, nothing. The floor, ceiling, and walls all felt like cloth. We sat in there for probably half an hour, and nobody found us. When we finally came out, we refused to tell anyone where we'd been. We won hide and seek the next several times they came over, until someone eventually saw us coming out after everyone had already given up looking. I told my dad about the room, and he had never seen it before either. He told the rest of my aunts and uncles, and I remember my uncle Eric, who was about 6 feet 6 inches, crawling into the room. He barely fit, but with childlike excitement, he told the rest of his siblings to get in there with him. I think only my dad joined him, but it was amazing hiding in the closet with my dad and uncle, and having them be proud of me for finding it. My dad and all his siblings grew up in this house, so it was a real shock to them. I just looked it up. It's $800,000 and over 6,000 square feet today, just for size and reference. The basement was a big part of hide and seek, and didn't count toward the square footage because it was unfinished. There were 7 closet to bedroom-sized rooms in the basement, as well as a workshop and a large open normal basement area. Unrelated last tidbit, I remember being a dumb kid and wanting to hide in the chest freezer in the basement, and my brother had to tell me 2 things. That sip's how kids die, and the food in there has freezer burn from the 1950s. When my grandparents moved 12 years after the story above, they were very concerned about how they were going to move all the meat and vegetables from the chest freezer. We tried lying to them, saying it wouldn't fit in their new place, and they argued until we agreed to move the whole thing. We didn't. I don't know the exact outcome, but we ended up throwing away all the food in a 4-foot tall, 8-foot wide, 4-foot deep chest freezer. The stuff on top was from the 1980s, and the stuff on the bottom was unrecognizable. My dad just shrugged and said, they were raised by the Great Depression. Story 19. I rented a small cabin in the woods years ago for about 8 months. It was pretty old and gross, but I had just gone through a breakup, so the solitude was nice. There was no internet, no cable, and heat came from a wood stove. After the first month, I got my electric bill. It was over $400. I called the electric company, and they sent someone to check the place. Even with everything off except the fridge, the meter was spinning like a top. He helped me look through the house for whatever was using the power, but we found nothing. Over the next few weeks, I was buying stuff to update and furnish the cabin. I had purchased a new floor mat for the bathroom. When I got home and lifted the old mat, I discovered a little door. It had no handle, so I had to grab something to pry it up. Inside was a ladder going down, about 7 feet into a room, maybe 5 feet by 5 feet. It had a dirt floor and 2 full-length electric baseboard heaters, both on full blast. There was no water heater or anything else, completely empty. Honestly, it felt like a place where you might keep a prisoner in a horror movie. The fact that the cabin was in the middle of a protected forest, with absolutely nobody around, didn't help my imagination. Still, it was one of the weirder things I've found in a place I've lived. The electric bill went way down after that. Then the old lady ghost started crying out, "Help!" from the nearby woods. True story, I'll share that one too. Update for the second story. By this point, I had been living in the remote cabin for about 6 months. It was a mouse and spider-infested mess. I was extremely reclusive at that point in my life, so I put up with the place in exchange for complete solitude. There was nobody around for miles, just woods in every direction. Behind the cabin were the remains of a house that had burned down a few hundred years earlier. All that was left was a stone foundation, and inside it was a small graveyard. The gravestones all had the same date of death, which suggested the people had died in the fire. One night around midnight, I was sitting inside playing guitar when I heard a noise. At first, I couldn't even tell if it was coming from inside the cabin or outside. Then it became clear it was a voice, an old woman crying out for help. Soft and desperate, I heard, "Help, help." I got chills, and my heart started racing. I walked around the cabin to see where it was coming from. It continued, "Help, help." I tried looking outside, but it was pitch black. My screen door started lightly banging out front, so I looked through the window. Nothing. By now, I was basically in a full panic attack. This went on for about 30 minutes, so I opened the door and started yelling, "What? Who's there?" After a few shouts, I heard the cry for help again. It seemed like it was right in front of me, but there was nothing there. In a last-ditch effort, going against everything I've ever learned from horror movies, I swung the door open and let out a guttural primal scream. Standing in front of me was a feral cat. It let out a meow that sounded exactly like an old woman saying help. It turned out I had put out traps to deal with the mice problem, and now, with no mice around, the cat had come out from under the house, looking for food. Over the next few days, around 9 different cats came out from under my house. They had been living there the entire time, but had to relocate when their steady supply of mice was gone. To this day, it remains one of the most terrifying nights of my life, and I laughed hysterically for about an hour afterward, like the terrified but relieved, hair-raising kind of laughter. Eventually, the house was deemed uninhabitable, so I moved out, but it was by far the scariest place I've ever lived, even after spending 5 years in one of the most dangerous parts of Boston. Story 20. We bought a house that had been converted into a 3-flat and rehabbed it into a single-family home with 3 floors. It was built in 1880. There were nooks and crannies all over the place. The previous owners had cut off entire 8 by 8 foot pockets of the house on the top 2 floors, for no real reason. It reminded me of the room Bad Ronald was forced to live in from the cheesy 1970s horror movie. That was easy to convert into proper closet space. But then came the basement apartment. The guy who lived there had been there from 1968 to 2000 when he died. He was apparently a recluse from Eastern Europe who didn't speak English, worked 60 hours a week, and drank at a local bar 40 hours a week. The shower I took out had at least 1,000 straight razors lodged in the drain pipe. I'm not sure what his logic was there. I removed all the asbestos drywall, revealing cubby holes and false walls everywhere. Every space between the studs was filled with beer cans to the top, and the gap was sealed once it was full. One space between the studs was expressly for rubbing alcohol in apothecary-style bottles he would use to achieve that top flight. High on a quiet Friday night when the booze wasn't enough, newspapers were stacked in false rooms, with dead rat skeletons who had given up trying to burrow through the massive stacks. Then there was the safe. In the utility room, he had built what looked like a tool cabinet between the fuse boxes. The tools were hung neatly on hooks. I removed the tools and set them aside because they were quality and could be used or sold. The cabinet was built like a tank, firmly anchored into the wall. I decided to approach it piece by piece to find a weak point. I removed the roughly 100 hooks that were dug into the board. Then came the 6-inch screws anchoring the backboard into the studs, 50 of them in total. I used a crowbar to pull back the board, revealing the exposed area behind the wall. Inside was $41,500 in $150 bills, dated back to the 1950s. There were 42 1-ounce gold coins, each worth $1,211 at the time. Additionally, there were 122 U.S. Treasury bonds, with a total purchase value of $12,200, which would have been worth $24,400 upon cashing. The total value came to just under $117,000. We took all the proper steps with our state authority that handles unclaimed property to locate an heir or estate connected to the find. The cash, commodities, and treasury bonds were placed in a state safe deposit box, and we were required to wait 5 years before the property could be declared found. For the first 2 years, they conducted a worldwide search for known relatives, wills, or testaments that might have been filed. Nothing turned up. We put it out of our minds and waited the remaining 3 years. Life got in the way, but eventually we received a letter saying the 5-year period had ended. At that point, we deposited the cash into a certificate of deposit, placed the gold into our own safe deposit box until we could sell it at a market peak for a gain of 20% or more, and donated the treasury bonds to a general scholarship fund at my wife's small college. We paid the incidental taxes, converted the certificate of deposit into an index fund when the market bottomed in 2008, and sold the gold at $1,560 an ounce around the same time, putting that into the index fund as well. Not a single penny has ever been touched for personal use. We do fine financially, so the money will likely be distributed as scholarships and charitable contributions to human services organizations. But there will never be another moment like the one I had when that cabinet wall peeled open. Story 21. My family used to own a small travel and insurance agency, which also handled lottery coupons in town. They had set it up in an old house about a 3-minute walk from where my parents and I lived. The house had a large backyard where my cousin and I used to play almost every day, and where the family sometimes celebrated birthdays. In the backyard, there was a pavilion or canopy adjacent to the house, to your left when you went outside. The house wall ended right above the first floor and gave way to what my cousin and I always described as the attic. It was basically a big dusty room with wood paneling. When we were younger, my cousin and I weren't allowed to go up there, and honestly, no one else wanted to, so no one did. I think the first time we went up there, we were about 10 years old. We might not have even noticed it at first because it was so dark. There were only 2 really small windows, but we eventually saw a small hole in the left wall, just big enough for the 2 of us to crawl through. When we noticed the hole, we grabbed some flashlights, because it was even darker in there than in the attic. Looking inside, we saw a short corridor diagonally in front of us. The opposite wall was only about 40 inches away. The corridor didn't lead anywhere to the left or right, but directly across from the hole was a doorway, without a door, and through it we saw a lonely chair standing in the middle of the room next to a wooden chest. I wanted to go in, but my cousin was scared. I could understand why the way that chair stood in the room reminded me of something out of a horror movie, even back then, but I was determined to see what was in the chest. We stepped back from the hole to talk it over. In my mind, we were about to find something amazing, maybe treasure the previous owners had hidden or forgotten, or perhaps clothes from a long-forgotten era. My cousin, on the other hand, was convinced we would find something horrific, like severed heads left by a serial killer. I don't remember if I ended up going in alone, or if I tried to convince my cousin to come along. But the next time I attempted to enter, I noticed a huge wasp nest hanging from the ceiling to the left of the corridor. I was, and still am, terrified of wasps. So I told my cousin, and we decided to drop the idea. I think I was 12 or 13 when I had a friend over, and we decided to finally go in and take a look. We had never seen any wasps come out of that nest, or even up in the attic, so we figured it must have been really old. In the end, we spent maybe 5 minutes tops in the room with the chair. I can't really remember what the rest of the room looked like, since most of it was hidden from the hole, but we did manage to get the chest out. To say I was disappointed at finding only old newspaper clippings, after years of wondering what could be inside, would be an understatement. I wasn't even allowed to keep them. My grandma took them with her, and I have no idea where they are now. Story 22. Years ago, I lived in a house turned apartments in an older city, probably built in the late 1800s judging by the style. During one particularly rowdy party, a girl was sitting with her back against the wall in my roommate's bedroom when she leaned back, and the drywall snapped in half in a large section. Normally, this wouldn't happen due to wall joists, but it was an old house, so we didn't think much of it. My roommate worked in construction, and I kept telling him it needed to be repaired before the landlord saw it. We were already on thin ice because of our parties, but he'd just shrug and say, yeah, I'll get to it. Months went by, and nothing happened. When we were served a 30-day eviction notice, I came down hard about the hole in the wall. It was going to affect my share of the security deposit. Again, I was met with the usual, "I'll get to it" resistance. Eviction eve arrived, and I was hounding him. He assured me he was on his way with the necessary supplies. I spent the time prepping the hole, removing the broken drywall, and making sure it would only take a few cuts, screws, and some joint compound to make it blend in. It didn't have to be perfect, just unnoticeable. He finally arrived at 11 p.m. with a piece of drywall, joint compound, and a drill. We had to be out by 8 a.m., and the landlord would be there to make sure we weren't destroying the place. By that point, I was a wreck, about to lose $800 over a wall. I didn't even break. I was bringing the last of the supplies up when I noticed my roommate shining a flashlight into a small hole behind the wall. "Dude," he said, "there sits a treasure chest back there." I was incredulous. I was still furious about the drywall disaster, but I looked, and sure enough, there was the corner of a classic, weathered pirate-style treasure chest poking out from a small walled-off room. At this point, I had adopted a screw-it mentality. I had already written off the $800 in my mind, so why not investigate? What if it was full of doubloons or something, and I was suddenly rich? This was happening around midnight. He ran to his truck, grabbed a small sledgehammer, and started smashing through the brick and mortar the drywall had been hiding. I just stood there laughing at the sheer lunacy of the situation. Eventually, he broke out a hole big enough to crawl through. I heard the creak of the lid opening and practically shouted, "What the hell is in it?" His response, dejected, shattered the moment. Buttons, shirt buttons. Sure enough, he dragged the chest out, and inside were about 8 shirt buttons, a fork, and a few crumbling pages of some long-forgotten book. I had never been more disappointed in my life. It was around 2 a.m. The next 5 hours were spent carefully stuffing the mortar and drywall back into the hole. Somehow, the landlord never noticed. I was in the room when he glanced directly at the wall. It was wet, but he never touched it. I got most of my security deposit back, other deductions aside, and I still have the treasure chest. It was, without a doubt, a roller coaster of an evening. Story 23. Our family owns the whole building. Well, in the country I live in, that's normal. Families usually own an entire building and then divide apartments among the sons of the grandparents. So my dad owns one apartment, each of his brothers has theirs, and owning a separate house is rare. Fast forward to my 20s. My grandpa wanted to move into a bottom-floor apartment we had, since my grandma had passed away. It was kind of underground. You had to go down a staircase to get to it. While we were breaking up the floor tiles in the kitchen, we noticed a small hole in the middle of the ground. Curious, we started digging, and suddenly, we had uncovered a huge cave. The entrance was very tight. It didn't go downward like a normal cave. It ran horizontally into the side of the underground wall. My uncle and I carefully crawled inside to explore. What we found shocked us. 6 large old vases and 2 boxes, all empty. It was impressive, but the real surprise came when we looked at the opposite wall. It had modern, not ancient, building blocks, poorly covered with cement. Whoever had built it tried to hide this side of the cave, but not very well. As it turns out, we had a neighbor in the building next to ours, a foreigner from Saudi Arabia, who had lived there for only a couple of months. He had discovered the cave by accident through his below-ground apartment bathroom. To throw my family off, he came up with a story. He asked permission to dig a well. Yes, a well right in the middle of a civilized town. Surprisingly, my grandpa believed him and gave him permission to dig at night. It didn't take him long to access the cave from his side. Over time, he took whatever was there, usually Roman gold and coins, and then simply disappeared from the country, filthy rich. We recently revisited the cave and found a tiny hole on one side of the wall. It was no wider than a straw, but we managed to slip a long foldable pole about 2 meters inside it. It went all the way in. For now, the wall behind that hole remains unexplored. It's unsafe, and we're not sure what might be hidden there, but the possibilities are tantalizing. It would cost us a lot of money to make the site safe, and even getting a metal detector is a problem. Metal detectors are banned here specifically because of situations like this. That's not even counting the difficulty of finding people willing to help, without demanding a huge cut, or the fear that they might be undercover agents. So for now, all we can do is wait and hope. Wish us luck. P.S. In the country I live in, Jordan, finding caves like this isn't actually that rare. Some families discover them on their land or beneath their homes, but most never access them. They keep it hidden and never talk about it, because getting caught can lead to serious trouble with the government, seizure of property, or even arrest. There's also a deep cultural fear involved. Many people believe these caves are protected by jinn, supernatural beings said to guard buried gold and ancient treasures. People genuinely fear curses, possession, or misfortune if they disturb them. That said, people have found gold, Roman coins, artifacts, and valuables before some discoveries were seized by authorities, while others were quietly sold for enormous amounts of money. You can even find reports of this if you look it up. Also, visibility inside the cave is extremely poor, even with flashlights. Story 24. Not so much a secret room, but a long forgotten one. My parents moved into the house. We still live in a few years before I was born. It has a very small attic, more like a narrow triangle, at the very top of the pointed roof. It runs the entire length of the house, which is quite long, but it isn't high enough for me to sit upright. I can crawl through it though. My parents aren't overweight, but they're too tall to fit up there. I'm the only one who can really move around in the attic. They can climb the stairs, stick their heads up through the opening, and grab things if they're close enough, but they can't actually crawl inside or reach the far end of the house. We store all the usual attic stuff up there, very old toys from when I was a baby or a kid, things from my dad's old jobs, doll houses and dolls, a hammock, camping gear, normal attic junk. About a year and a half ago, when I was 20, I went up there to look for something specific. My parents swore it was stored in the attic, but I hadn't seen it before. While moving things around to make more crawl space, I noticed something odd. I had never realized just how long our house was. In the attic, visibility was poor because of all the stored items. When I moved some things around, I suddenly noticed an entire section of the attic I hadn't seen before. I had assumed the attic ended after a big pile of stuff, but behind that pile was an even tinier hole, just barely wide enough for me to worm my body through. It opened up into another section of attic space. I ended up in a completely new part of the attic, full of forgotten moving boxes, from when my parents had moved in as young people, long before I was born. My mom was standing on the stairs, watching me crawl through the hole, and she said, "Oh my God, I completely forgot we had stuff there." A true light bulb moment. The boxes contained all sorts of things, and it was a real challenge to get them out through the tiny hole and downstairs, because many had nearly eroded after more than 20 years of sitting untouched. Most of it had become loose items, rather than intact boxes. Inside, there were all sorts of treasures, crockery, glassware, flat-pack shelving, old curtains from my mom's grandmother's house that had mostly disintegrated, a porcelain doll, and some very old plastic toys from my mom. There was the leash of my dad's childhood dog, and a very simple lockbox with the key still inside, holding his primary and high school report cards, along with his graduation certificate. There were also some photo albums in appallingly bad condition, an old electric fan, an ancient cassette player, and much more. My dad almost cried over the old dog leash. It was so strange, after all these years, he hadn't realized it had survived. I had never realized just how big our attic actually was. We never really started using that area, because it's such a pain to crawl in there. I'm not as small as I once was, so I barely fit anymore. Still, it was fun for my parents to see all that forgotten stuff and remember pieces of their past. Story 25. Nothing too crazy, but when I was a kid, my dad rented an old rundown farmhouse in Ontario, Canada. It was a beautiful house, but it really needed some TLC. Dad called it the half and half house, because one side was obviously for the owners. Stained glass, a rounded entry door, detailed wooden staircase, large bedrooms with plaster ceiling medallions, while the other half was for farmhands, or maybe slaves, with small rooms, a tight, cramped staircase, and uneven everything. Dad and the landlord worked out a deal that in exchange for cheaper rent, he would fix up the place. Previous tenants had partied hard, broken stuff, and left holes in the walls. One room on the crappy half had walls covered in permanent marker drawings, mostly dongs, and some more dongs. Dad painted over them again and again before finally giving up and installing new drywall. Being the 1990s, with zero regard for a child's safety, I was volunteered to help and breathed in that sweet dust-filled air, most likely asbestos, without the pesky hindrance of a face mask. We were mid-dong room reno when my dad started hammering on the wall in the closet. About 10 seconds in, he hit the wall and pretty much his entire hand went through, hammer and all. Turns out, the side panel in the closet was a false wall. Someone had just slapped drywall over it decades ago. Naturally, we all lost our minds. We got my brother and sister in and started tearing the wall down. Behind it was an old doorway, leading to a narrow hallway that ran parallel to both halves of the house. Dad grabbed a flashlight and stepped in, warning us to stay out, or all of us will go ass first into the frigging kitchen. He went in and didn't plummet to his immediate death, and discovered that the hallway led to a set of boarded-over wooden doors into the rooms on the other side. There was nothing cool. No old coins, no lost Rembrandts, no skeletons. Just a shit ton of dust and some old nails. We all signed a piece of cardboard that said, "We were here 1994, and stuck it up so it would be the first thing anyone saw if the wall was ever opened again. Looking back, I still don't understand the purpose of that hallway. It was a relatively small house. It would have taken less than a minute to go down the small flight of stairs, across the kitchen, and up the other flight. I guess the idea was just to keep the help out of sight and out of mind. I drove by in 2012, and the house was still standing. Whoever owns it now has done a beautiful job fixing it up. It looks like a brand new 200-year-old farmhouse. I wanted to stop in and ask if they'd found the secret room, but I figured I'd rather keep the mystery alive for myself. Story 26. Many years ago, I was renovating my flat, which I have long since sold. I had suspected for a while that the kitchen was too narrow, as from the outside the building appeared clearly 2 meters shallow. Even comparing it with a cupboard next to the kitchen entrance, it seemed the kitchen should be larger than it was. When I first realized this, I wasn't in a position to start renovations and didn't want to tear down the kitchen on a hunch. A few years later, when it finally came time to renovate, the kitchen was being removed, and I wanted to investigate. I had a builder come by who was doing the work, and he agreed with my theory. We proceeded to drill some holes to check, and indeed, we were right. We sledged the wall down after cutting the electricity, as there was 70s-style wiring and other remnants left in the wall. Not only was I correct that there was at least a 2-meter space, it was actually a good 3 by 4 meters. The room didn't adjoin anything else, and looking more closely at the leasehold plans, it appeared to be an extra room that the flat had never been advertised with, but was on the plans. In terms of condition, there was some must and rot in the plasterboard. The light fitting was old and unwired, and we noted that the window on the side of the building actually belonged to this room. We verified it did not belong to the flat next door, as there was a building maintenance room in between, confirming it was indeed part of this flat. We discovered that whoever had renovated the flat in the 80s had decided they didn't need the room and wanted the kitchen where it was. They had simply walled it up, leaving all the 70s-style fittings intact. I was renovating the flat to sell it. Aside from the minor setback of having to reconsider where the kitchen would go and making this newly found room the bathroom, I turned a 3-bedroom flat into a 4-bedroom just by knocking down a wall. I was more than happy with that outcome. Sadly, there was nothing in the room except old decor that needed removing and asbestos to be dealt with. No secret messages from the dead, no family heirlooms, unless you counted a few leftover pieces of wood from the partition wall. Just enough space for a new bathroom and the kitchen next door. Story 27. I moved around a lot as a kid, and my siblings and I made it our mission to explore every inch of every house we lived in. In one of the houses, there had been noticeable renovations and several small crawl spaces. To reach the upstairs portion, a staircase led to a landing that circled back to the 2 upstairs bedrooms. Near the top of the stairs, in a corner, was built-in shelving, and next to it was a crawl space, just wide enough for a grown person to lie down and high enough to sit with hunched shoulders. It might have served a different purpose previously, as there was an odd window that looked over our driveway. The flooring was uneven, made of loose wooden pieces, and the space was now intended only for accessing insulation and pipes. It wasn't until I spent a day searching for my cat that I realized the shelving was incomplete, and a small hole the size of 2 fists in the wall led deeper into the crawl space. It turned out my cat really enjoyed sitting next to the odd window, so I would put blankets down for her and lie next to her while playing on my DS most weekends. She was usually skittish and would run away if you tried to pet her, but in the crawl space, she was a lazy, sun-kissed cuddlebug. Bonus story: not exactly a hidden crawl space, but I remember standing outside one of the many houses we just moved into, trying to understand its layout with my parents. That house was unique, to say the least. The backyard backed onto a private business, so we occasionally saw random people wandering through. The cellar could only be reached from a door in the yard leading underground. The strangest feature was that one of the bedrooms had a closet containing a set of stairs leading to 2 large bedrooms, one painted an atrocious pink, scribbled over in crayon, and the other a shining Stephen King horror movie green, with bathroom tiles on the wall and a wireframe bed in the middle. Much of the stairway wall was chipping off in large chunks, and at the sight of the bed, I immediately noped out of there. Another odd feature was a ramp to nowhere along the back of the house that lined up with the closet stairs inside. Thankfully, we didn't stay in that house long. It wasn't my favorite. There was no heating upstairs, only one outlet per room, and it was located in a rough neighborhood. Story 28. Back in the early 1970s, my parents owned a place in Raveno, Ohio, on Wall Street. It had a full basement with not 1, but 3 secret rooms that my brothers and I discovered. Of course, we never told our parents, but each of us had our own private hidey-hole. One was located behind a wall and extended underneath my parents' bedroom and the concrete patio. It was large enough for a 7-year-old to stand in and tapered to about a foot at the back, roughly 10 by 15 feet. When we found it, it was full of old paint cans and construction junk, along with some rusty tools and dirty magazines. Score. The second was behind a 5 by 5 foot black glass mirror. Volcanic, I think, built into a homemade basement bar. Whoever made it clearly intended it to be a secret, as you had to flip the beer taps in a specific way to unlock it. I actually ran into it hard and accidentally unlocked it, but I figured it out quickly when I noticed wires running from the taps. The mirror slid back about 1/4 of an inch, then to the side, revealing a 10 by 10 foot room with a chair, an ottoman, a small couch, and a huge TV record player stereo in a floor cabinet. A big wooden monster with tubes and all the works. All the walls were covered in egg cartons, and that soft foam they used to pack items in. I now know it was for sound dampening. There were pornography posters everywhere else, along with what I now recognize as drug paraphernalia, probably cocaine and heroin. It was likely someone's drug den for getting high and chilling. The third secret room was behind a water heater enclosure. There was about 3 feet of space all around the heater. If you pushed on the wall behind it, a small hidden door, about 3 by 3 feet and waist high for a child, would open. Crawling inside revealed a 5 by foot room, all concrete block, painted black, with a single light bulb hanging from a pull string. There was a big metal door in the floor, like a safe door, but without a combination, just a handle. It was so heavy we could never lift it, so we have no idea what was underneath. It looked built right into the floor. We moved out in the early 1980s, and the house has sold at least twice since then, according to what I can find. It looks exactly the same from the outside. I don't think we ever told our parents, who have both passed, and as far as I know, it's all still there. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.